And you're good.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome from cold and snowy Charlottesville, Virginia, which is a little unusual for us on March 3rd. But we are so happy to be here and excited to have a chance to do a little bit more of a real-time interactive session. I have my coffee because it's 9 o'clock here in Charlottesville. And even if that sounds late, and it's certainly not as early as it is on the West Coast or in other parts of the world, but I'm not a morning person. So I may need some artificial caffeine that will keep me awake. But we have so many fantastic questions to deal with that as Leslie, oh, right, and I want you to meet Leslie. Leslie, come over here and peek in the camera and say hello to everyone so they can see this person who is the person who's really made it all happen. There's Leslie.
Nice to meet you.
It's so we know it's Leslie who's made it all work. She's been compiling your questions, and I know that I myself have promised to answer one or two of them. So we have a pretty long list. So I'm just going to get started and jumping in on some buckets of questions. And if I miss yours, then we'll hope again for a chance to talk more on the forum. One of the things I've done is I've selected questions that are just kind of hard to answer on the forum. There are questions that are a little bit more in depth, take a little bit more time. And so those are the questions that I've tried to focus on in thinking about how to spend our hour together this morning. And also, you know, you can tweet questions, and Leslie is standing by to pick those up as well. So let's get started. One of the things that I promised quite a few people was that we would walk through a hypothetical timeline for a design thinking project. So let me go ahead and pull something up here. I've been given instructions from Jared. Let's see if I could just get it all to work. Look at this, share. And all right, did I do it? Yay! My first technology triumph of the morning. Great. So as we look at this, there are some things on here that will look very familiar to you, mostly the steps. We've talked a lot about this methodology that we've developed to walk us through a project. And again, design thinking has lots of wonderful tools. You don't need to use them in an end-to-end process at all. But our experience has been when people who are not designers are learning the process for the first time, it's very helpful to follow something all the way through in addition to just using the tools. Because our time in Coursera together is limited, we haven't been able to really dig in and do a project, and I'll talk some more about that. But what I'd like to give you an idea of is what it looks like in real life to walk through a complete project using these tools. Now, as you look at the estimated time to complete, obviously every project is different. So some may take longer and some may take shorter, but just to give you a general sense, for instance, when we start up a project, that's a piece that can move very quickly. So it has to do with getting a group of people together, usually, to make sure that we're identifying an opportunity that meets the criteria for design thinking, and that design thinking can be an especially effective method. And then spending some time scoping it, as we've talked about, going broader to see if that would make for a better project brief or narrower. Right? And then finally trying to capture our thoughts in the design brief, talking specifically about what it is we're trying to accomplish, who our target customer or user is, what the metrics are that would let us know we're succeeding, what's in the bounds of the project, what's out. And then finally, step 4, making a set of plans. So laying out some kind of thinking about what are the particular tools we want to use, who are the particular people we want to interview, where will we find them, how many of them will we interview, what will we ask them when we interview them. Right? So these first 4 steps can actually go very quickly if you have the time to devote to them. So for instance, I estimate you're probably already carrying an idea for an opportunity around in your head. So when you sit down to actually put it on paper, very quick. Same way with scoping. Sometimes scoping can be one where if you've got a group of people who see the problem differently, that's a place to spend more time. So you'll notice I have a pretty big range there. When you're bringing together a group with diverse perspectives on the problem, taking something like a half day to actually talk through what are the different levels at which we could address this opportunity can make a huge difference. We are writing the story right now of a college that has been trying to look at how to retain more students who are going to school under challenging circumstances. They spent almost a whole day scoping their project because what they found is some had a very narrow scope. Let's get in there and try and make the initial week at school better. And others had this broad scope in which they wanted to look at everything. And so over time, they went back and forth in this scoping process. And it really meant a lot to the team to take that time to listen to each other's perspectives and to try to come to some hypothesis about what made the most sense for their scope. And again, everything in design thinking is a hypothesis. So even after we've selected an area of opportunity and scoped it and written the design brief itself is always a work in process. And we need to go back and be ready to change it whenever we learn something that helps us to think more deeply about the opportunity. As we've talked about, one of the key things that design thinking brings to a problem is often in this deep immersion in what is, it encourages us to reframe how we see the problem. And since conventional solutions tend to come out of conventional definitions of the problem, when we take the time to really push ourselves to come up with deeper, more thoughtful, more creative definitions of the problem, it tends to point us towards more creative solutions to that problem eventually. So again, these first 4 steps can be done very quickly. I mean, we could pull a team together probably and do it in a day of intense, concentrated effort. Or it can stretch over a longer period of time. Step 5 is really where the big time commitment is, and that depends upon the nature of your research plan and how much interviewing you're doing. In our MBA projects here, I ask the students to interview a minimum of 16 people for the projects. And again, one of the things we've talked about in design thinking is that the ends of our initial what is research tend to be pretty small. In fact, there are some interesting questions that you've posted that I'll get to a little bit later, where someone's asking, how do I do this with 5 million people? Right? And how do I compare the 20 people they talk to for BU Health with the 5 million people I have to talk to? Again, keep in mind, when we're doing what is research, our goal is not to statistically significantly describe a population. Our goal is to be inspired with new ideas. And that's why the idea of going very deep to understand a much smaller number, rather than using surveys and traditional methodologies to go very broad, is so useful, because it's our deep work to uncover those unarticulated needs, to really understand their pain points. That's what will inspire more creative ideas as we go into what if. Right? So the small n really doesn't trouble us. In some ways, if we interviewed one person and in that interview developed a very deep insight that let us see the world differently and come up with a truly novel and valuable solution to their pain, what did it matter that we didn't interview all those other people, right? The testing stage comes as we get into what wows and what works, right? So we really have 2 phases of research. The first phase of research during what is the exploration aimed at inspiring more creative ideas. We'll talk a little bit later in the process about the second phase of research, which happens during what wows and what works, which is the testing phase, in which we take the hypotheses we generated in the early part and we test them with real users. So when we get to step 5, depending upon the numbers of interviews we're doing, it can take quite a bit of time. In my MBA class, where the students have to do 16 interviews and are mostly on teams of 4, I give them 2 to 3 weeks to complete their interviews. Now they're doing things outside of class. Unfortunately, they have to take classes other than mine. So they've got a lot of other stuff going on, but by nature, setting up and conducting interviews takes quite a bit of time. You need to prepare for them. You need to write the interview instrument and get ready. You need to set up the interview. And oftentimes when you're interviewing people, you can't just appear. You have to set an advance appointment, which often means that they're not available for another week or sometimes 2 weeks. Right? Then you have to meet with them, you have to do the interview, and then you have to carefully synthesize what you learned in the interview. When you take that process times 12 or 16 or 20 interviews, it actually takes quite a bit of time. So in many ways, you can do most parts of the design thinking process quite quickly if you're able to focus on it. But the research piece here just takes a lot of time. So keep that in mind. We then go into another period where we can move pretty quickly. So out of our research, we then move into the identification of these critical insights that we then turn into design criteria. So now, ideally, we've aligned our team around a set of design criteria, and we're finally ready to generate some ideas. Right. This piece can go rather quickly. We often do insights identification sessions as half-day sessions. Right? Now, like all things in design thinking, iteration helps a lot. So for instance, in my MBA class, I will do a couple of hour insight identification session with students, and then they will go and do a second one working with their team. This is often a place where you can invite other important stakeholders into the process. Identify insights if you use the kind of gallery methodology we talk about. You get posters on the walls and you invite people who haven't been terribly involved in the process, but who can help you look at what you've gathered and draw deep insights from it. So these are not lengthy. In fact, once you've done all of the hard work of identifying insights, establishing design criteria is very quick. They kind of fall out of good insights, literally. Then you can brainstorm, again, depending upon how many brainstorming sessions. Brainstorming is a great place to reach out and invite other stakeholders, right? Because they can help you generate all kinds of ideas, and their beginner's mind, the fact that they haven't been part of all of your research, means they'll come up with ideas that you won't. And then these ideas that you can either keep as you go into concept development and creating your napkin pitches, or you can toss if they're ones that don't work. But you've had them to work with, and that's the important part. So again, these next stages, all of the what if stages, and then most of the what wow stages can really be condensed, again, into pretty intense periods of time. And I say intense because my own experience tells me setting aside 1 hour a week to do something, by the time you remind everyone what you did last week, you got half an hour to actually get anything done, and that's not enough. So I think intense periods means that we put aside other work for a half day or some chunk of time where we can really immerse ourselves in the work we're doing and make forward progress, right? It doesn't mean you have to take 2 weeks out of your calendar and your regular life and not do any of your other work, but it means that you don't want to do 1 hour a week for 10 weeks. You'd be better off taking 2 days and doing it intensively during these periods. And then finally, we get to the other time-consuming part. At the end of the process, we're ready for experimentation. Now, this is the testing research. So now we are taking our prototypes that we've created. We're first carrying them out to the field for these one-on-one co-creation sessions to get feedback from customers. Again, depending upon how many customers you want to talk to, that takes several hours to do one-on-one. So say we go back to the original 20 that we talked to the first time, right? We've got 20 hours of conversations. These are critical though, because they let us continue to refine our ideas so that for that step 14 learning launch, where we're actually going to conduct a marketplace experiment, we've already benefited from multiple iterations of what works. And then learning launches can run for as long as it takes you to test the important underlying assumptions. Again, which can be weeks, depending upon the nature of the project. And then finally, step 15. Well, step 15 is really its own design thinking project. Here, you're taking an idea that you've now kind of perfected the recipe for through the whole process, and you're ready to scale it, which means you have to design a process to do a kind of a traditional marketing on-ramp. You have to gain awareness of it among the people that you're trying to encourage to use it. You have to get them to trial it and see. You have to get them to come back and use it again. And in fact, that can either be a back of the napkin, quick set of thoughts, or in fact, it can become the opportunity you identify to go through an additional process. So that is, you can see why I didn't want to write that in a forum post, but that in my experience, having done now hundreds of these projects, is kind of how it works. I think there's a certain tempo to a project that is good. We want to feel pushed enough that there's a sense of energy and urgency and momentum. So in my experience, if you let a project go on too long and people keep dropping it in the middle and then picking it back up, you lose a lot of that energy and momentum. On the other hand, people are busy. There's not many people who are doing this instead of their real jobs. They're doing it along with their real jobs. And so figuring out how to keep enough pressure of schedule to keep the momentum going, but without overwhelming people and causing them to give up and say, you know, I just can't do this now. I have too much on my plate. I think that's the challenge of leadership in one of these projects. So I hope you found that helpful. Let's turn to some of the other questions. Let's see, I will stop screen sharing for a moment and I'm back. Great. Let's look at some of the other questions. Another, as I looked at the questions that came up, people called it different things, but it was around this topic of how do I sell design thinking in my organization? How do I gain credibility in my organization? How do I get buy-in? How do I produce the ROI that my skeptical boss always wants to see? And I mean, obviously, that's a big challenge for us, right? As we've talked about in class, design thinking is a way of operating that feels pretty foreign in large bureaucratic organizations, especially. It's not the way we've been taught to do things. And so, like anything else that's new, when we bring it into an organization that is different, whose basic values aren't necessarily in line with what we're asking them to do, we meet a lot of resistance. In this way, it's really no different than any other change we're trying to incorporate. For instance, you can imagine total quality management, what it was like during its introductory stages. I mean, now we think of Six Sigma as embedded in all organizations, right? But at one point in time, Six Sigma seemed strange and odd too, and its tools seemed like ones that were foreign to managers. And so I think, as with any change, we have to go back to what design thinking teaches us. Design thinking teaches us to start not with our definition of the problem and solution. I've got this great solution to everybody's problem, design thinking. Let me tell you why it's so wonderful. But instead, to start with our user. Start by looking at the world through their eyes and trying to understand what are their unmet needs. Design thinking is just a tool to help you more effectively meet the needs of someone you care about, someone who you're trying to create value for. And so stepping inside their head, not leading with design thinking, but leading with, you know, I think I may be able to help you make progress on your problem. Let's understand your problem more and see what we can do. So again, it's problem-led. As I work with companies like Intuit that have been very successful in bringing design thinking to the organization, what you find with them is they are not disciples of design thinking. They're problem-solving disciples. They're helpers. They're out there looking for ways to hitch design thinking to a set of already existing problems that they think it can be uniquely suited to helping people solve. We know that one of the great strengths of design thinking is it helps us in areas of uncertainty. So oftentimes it helps to find a persistent problem, a problem that has already not been solved using traditional methods. Again, in my experience as a teacher, you come to see that the only people that you cannot teach something to are people who already think they know the answer. I think step one in teaching anything is you have to have a learner who realizes they need something, that their current knowledge is incomplete. Right? And so oftentimes in organizations, if you find an issue that has refused to resolve itself using traditional methods, if it's an important issue and it's important to solve, people will try almost anything. It's interesting, here at Darden, we teach a lot of design thinking classes in different forms, and I rarely get managers who show up and want to argue about design thinking. They're here because they're frustrated with the toolkit they've got to solve their problems. They don't know whether design thinking will work for them yet, but they know they've got a problem that the methods already in their toolkit haven't been able to solve, and so they are open to trying something new. So again, I think those are the kinds of people we look for to work with, people who are open to trying something new, and people who have problems that are important and that need to be solved, but that don't necessarily lend themselves to our current toolkit. I think the third thing I'd say, and we say it over and over again here, is don't be afraid to start small. Again, one of the things we're constantly told in organizations is think big, especially if you're in a big organization. We find that one of the real dilemmas is managers get told, don't bring us any small ideas. I mean, we're a big company. We don't want something with small impact. Yes, we don't want to stay with ideas with small impact, but usually in an environment of uncertainty, we can't tell which ideas are possible for having big impact until we try them. So this idea of small experiments, not going out on a limb, not explaining to everyone in the world, I have this new tool, design thinking, bring me your worst problem and let me show you how it'll solve it. I don't think that's the way to go. I think the way to go is to begin practicing by finding some smaller problems in which you can begin to demonstrate results. That's the answer to the boss who wants the ROI. There's nothing in design thinking out of the starting block that's going to give us an ROI. What it gives us is the chance to develop a deep understanding of customers or whoever we want to serve, come up with some novel ideas, experiment in some small, low-cost, fast bets to learn more, and then come up with something that we're ready to really pilot. And as we begin to really pilot, then we begin to get the data that we need for the ROI. Only instead of the kind of fabricated data we usually use to construct ROIs very early in a project where we really have no idea, for instance, what revenues it's capable of, we now can begin to develop a more compelling ROI by using this actual marketplace data we've gotten from our experiments. I hope that was helpful. But that's an important one, and we'll keep talking about it. Let me have a sip of coffee and go next. There's a third question, how best to spread design thinking? Well, of course, that's something we think a lot about at the university. In some ways, my own personal passion is how do we bring this design thinking toolkit to every individual for whom it might help them improve their lives and the lives of the others they work with. So the obvious way to spread any new technique is to go to class. Right? And so, for instance, we have a variety of classes we teach. In April, we'll be teaching a 1-week in-person class here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and would love to welcome anyone who'd like to join us there. We'll spend the whole week learning design thinking in a small class atmosphere, and it will be a great experience. But it's an experience that won't be available to very many people. So how do we help all of the people who don't have the funds or the ability to come to a place like Charlottesville, Virginia, to learn? Well, one of the things that we do is we create courses like this one, right, that introduce a topic and that allow you to begin to get a sense of, well, what is this design thinking thing all about? How could it help me? And is it really worth devoting myself to doing more? And then in the middle, you have some other coursework we've created around design thinking, which I can tell you more about in a bit, but that's project focused. I think at some point to spread design thinking, people have to be doing projects. So we've had the chance in this Coursera course to be introduced to the idea and the tools, and we've had the chance to look at some examples of other organizations using it. And as part of fulfilling the requirements, you've been asked to pick several tools and demonstrate that those individual tools have been ones that you've been able to use and learn from in your environment. Right? So you've begun this journey, but you're not really going to really learn design thinking until you tackle a full-scale project. Right? It could be a small project, but it's a project, and you start beginning with step one and you take it all the way through. Right? So we're finding in organizations that I think the ones that have been most successful at spreading design thinking have come from both the top down and the bottom up. Right? There's been senior level support to bring it in as a concept. And this is something we are seeing more and more in organizations, and acceptance by senior leaders that we need new methodologies, and an invitation to come in and create universities within companies or organizations that offer those skills. But I also think the most successful companies are building kind of a grassroots effort. That is, they're training people who then go out and mentor and work with other people. So it's kind of a cascade of learning, where we train a small group, they go out, they work with their people, and they bring the learning to them. Maybe you identify a next group and the cascade gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's almost a viral phenomena where people who are really interested come forward. There's this wonderful program at the U.S. Health and Human Services Agency that I've been studying in preparation for this new research we're doing on the use of design thinking in the social and government sector. At H&HS, they've created this program called Ignite. Anyone in the entire organization with an idea can apply to the Ignite program. And as part of that Ignite program, you'll get a little bit of funding and a little bit of time and some support and coaching, learning the tools that will allow you to apply these innovation methodologies to your idea. And then the final part is, if you follow through on all that, we'll give you the chance to pitch your idea to a senior person who can make a decision on it. Right? So instead of innovation or design thinking being owned by a small kind of tightly knit group of designers, it's basically something that's being offered to everybody in the organization who's interested in being an innovator. And I think that is an incredibly powerful methodology, and one that we'll see more of. And so I think thinking of spreading the word, just starting out small, by yourself, inviting others to investigate it more, inviting them to bring problems that you can work on solving together using the methodologies. The spread is a very kind of viral spread in a lot of situations where perhaps we don't have senior leadership support. But for me, the power of these methods are that you don't have to sit around waiting for permission to do them. You don't have to sit around and wait until a more senior person decides that it is okay if you use design thinking to solve your problems. These tools are within your control. You can pick issues in your own sphere of influence, to borrow Stephen Covey's language, and you can get to work tomorrow bringing these basic techniques. Right? We see school teachers taking these basic techniques and using them in their classroom. They're not waiting for the school superintendent to give them permission. They're not even waiting for their principal to say, yes, please do this. They're just taking the initiative to do these small scale projects on their own. And in the end, they are making a difference to each of the children that are in their classroom. And if enough teachers do that, then we're making a difference to many, many children in many, many classrooms. That's the power of design thinking, I think. And I encourage you all who have found it to be of use to you to think of yourselves as kind of just a one-person virus. The opportunity is to spread that virus to all of the people who have problems that you think design thinking can help them solve. Great. So let's look at the next one. It kind of relates to this. Valerie says, I'm one person, I'm a solo entrepreneur, and we talk a lot about teams here. So how does this work? And Valerie's question reminded me of some other questions that people asked who say, I have to work with multiple third parties. So in some ways, those questions may look like they're the opposite of each other. I'm a solo entrepreneur and it's just me, how do I use this? Or I'm embedded in this web of relationships, and in order to get anything done, I need to bring a bunch of people in. So tell me, how does it help me do this? And I think the beauty of design thinking is it has lots of opportunities to accommodate both of those, right? So if we think of the early stages of the process, Well, I can scope an opportunity myself. I can define the project. I can draft a design brief and make a set of research plans, and I can go out and interview people. Right? We often suggest interviewing in pairs because when you're new to ethnographic interviewing, it's challenging to take notes and carry on a conversation at the same time. But if worse comes to worse, you can do it, because with these methods, you are only moving towards goodness, as I would say. What's the downside of a conversation with a customer about their needs? What's the downside of a conversation with employees about their pain points as they try and get their job done? I don't see any. So at worst, the design thinking process leaves you having had a deeper conversation with the people you're trying to serve. At best, it uncovers insights that you have never have had otherwise. And you can do that alone. Now, obviously, something like brainstorming, I mean, how do you brainstorm all by yourself? I'm not even sure that I can conceive of how to do that, because so much of the power of brainstorming is us feeding off of each other, right? But there's nothing that says I need a whole intact team dragging through the entire process with me. I have quite a few students who choose to do design thinking projects on their own. And when they get to brainstorming, and oftentimes insight identification as well, they invite a bunch of friends for pizza and hand them a stack of Post-it notes and throw them trigger questions to brainstorm together. They invite a group of friends in, maybe who know nothing about the project, have no depth of knowledge. But again, the combination of a beginner's mind, people who are truly open and haven't been shaped by a particular definition of the problem and research that you've done, when you combine that with an expert's mind, which you are now, having done all those interviews, they see different things. And sometimes the beginners see things that the experts do not. Right? And so what the student is able to do is take all those Post-its that come out of the pizza party, move into concept development, which they do by themselves, and take the Post-its that they see as useful and that have sparked ideas for great concepts for them and keep them, and the others they put aside. I think there are places in the process, like brainstorming, like co-creation, like identifying insights, that are wonderful opportunities to invite important stakeholders, like your multiple third parties in, who haven't necessarily been part of the conversation. Because you're not coming up with solutions. You're not promising them that whatever they came up with actually shows up in the final set of napkin pitches. You're just inviting them to be part of the conversation. Right? So again, I think it's an opportunity that can be done by one person, but there are selected points where you really need to invite other people in. And if you're already doing it with an intact team, there are also these similar opportunity points to broaden beyond just the team and invite people into the process. So I hope that's helpful. Let's see. Let me spend a little bit of time addressing Seth's question. Seth has been very persistent in his persistence question, if you've noticed on the forums. Seth is asking, when do I know when it's time to give up? Right, I was at a valedictory speech at some graduation class not long ago, and it was wonderful because the speaker said, you know, it's so great to be here to address all of you graduates, and I just wanted to give you one piece of advice that has really been helpful to me and my life, and I hope you'll take it to heart. And that piece of advice is, don't be afraid to give up. And of course, everyone laughed because the advice we expect to get is hang in there and make it work. And here's someone saying, don't be afraid to give up. One of the things that design thinking teaches us is we have to be willing to let go of things, right? We have to not fall in love with our ideas. We have to be open to the fact that the people we're trying to serve as we get into co-creation and prototyping and testing may not love the ideas that we love. In fact, what we frequently find, we always suggest to teams doing this work that they bring at least 10 napkin pitches to their clients. And I would say better than half of the time, the napkin pitches that the students have fallen in love with are not the ones the client selects to move into prototyping and experimentation and testing. And they have to let go. And it's very difficult. right? So how do we know when to let go and when to dig in and work? Because again, we know the other part of design thinking, the other part of success in general, is dedication and persistence and a willingness to hang in there and keep doing it. But let's think back to George and Jeff for a minute. One of the problems that George runs into is after he gets his idea, he's not willing or even able to see disconfirming data. He's not actually testing his hypotheses. He's looking for data to support it, and he's ignoring or discounting data that refutes it. And that is where persistence gets us in trouble. Because if we're trying to design for someone else, we cannot be persistent in imposing what we think is best on them. So this idea of having multiple options so that we don't fall in love with one, this idea that we'll talk about much more next week of how we test assumptions by surfacing that data and actually going out into the marketplace to see if our assumptions are actually true, that becomes really, really critical, because what you do want to let go of is ideas that as you test them, don't come back as ones that are the ideas that your users that you're trying to serve find valuable. When I was a business person, I always thought that telling someone, get out there and just try harder, keep working at it, was a good thing. But if our initial hypothesis isn't value adding to the people we're trying to serve, keeping at it and trying harder just wastes resources. One of my favorite statements out of our initial research on organic growth was a manager who said one of the keys to his success, he thought, was being able to call his own baby ugly. So an idea he had, he nurtured, he loved it, but at some point he had to admit it wasn't working. That's how small bets work, right? If you're afraid to stop, you can't keep doing more small bets or you'll collapse under the weight of them. So a lot of this methodology is not just starting new ideas, it's stopping them. It's calling the baby ugly. It's acknowledging that this isn't working. Right? So that's one way that I would frame this question of persist or give up. The other aspect, though, that I hear in that question is one of corporate culture and of change management. It's not the particular idea we're trying to decide whether to give up or not. It's we're trying to decide how much of our own personal energy to put behind continuing to championing something that we're getting resistance from. I think that's a critical question. In some ways, even in large organizations with lots of resources, we know that there is one resource that is ultimately limited. We have only 24 hours in our own day, and we have to sleep some of them. Right? So in some ways, the most scarce resource we have is our own personal time and attention. And the most strategic decision we make is how to spend that limited resource of our time and attention. For those of us who want to make the world a better place, the opportunities to do that are everywhere. But if we're not careful, we can dissipate our energy across so many different things that despite our good intentions, we don't get anything done. The wonderful work on flow that's been done at the University of Chicago, one of the professors there basically says, we can take that limited resource of our time and energy, and we can focus it like a laser beam so powerfully that we can cut through things and get things done. Or we can take that same time and energy and we can dissipate it across so many things till it's like a London streetlight on a foggy night. At the end of the day, nothing is different because of our efforts. So I think this idea of making wise choices about how we spend our energy, to me, it's really not a question of design thinking per se, although many of us try and decide that in relation to design thinking. It's more of a question of how we, one, look inside ourselves and figure out what's personally important to us and what we're passionate about. And then two, I think realistically about the environment we operate in and what's possible. We know also from our research that the most successful innovators are people we called pragmatic idealists. Sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it? What does it mean? Pragmatic idealists are people who are able to stand in the what is, in the current reality, and absolutely tell the truth about that reality. Not kid themselves that the world is going to love them or everyone's going to think this is the greatest thing in the world. Tell the truth about the current situation, but at the same time, they're able to hold hope for a different tomorrow. You know, it's easy when we tell the truth too brutally to give up and become pessimistic about our ability to make any change at all. It's also easy to be an optimist and to fall in love with this wonderful vision of a new tomorrow, but totally deny all of the hard work that it's going to take to get there. You don't succeed at making significant change using any methodology if you can't be both of those at the same time. So that's the challenge. How do we face up to the reality of the bureaucracies many of us live in and their resistance to innovation, all the while they ask for it, at the same time not lose our own passion and our hope that we in fact can make a difference and make things better. So let me talk a little bit about one piece of one approach to change management that I've always loved that helps me make that decision. And again, I think for all of us, it's a personal decision that we make about how to do this. And I just want to pull up a blank sheet here for a minute. Let's see, I'm double clicking. Wait a minute. All right. This is German. This is Jared, the person who makes everything work. I did it once. I thought I was on a roll. Okay. Thanks, Jared. What I'd like to do is sketch out for you very quickly this, it's kind of a silly little equation, but that often helps me strategically figure out where to put my scarce resource. So this says, let's see, am I doing something wrong there? Doesn't seem to be writing. Okay, again. All right, thank you. It says the amount of change you can think to accomplish or hope to accomplish, this is kind of an assessment tool, right, is equivalent to a few factors. The first is, what is the level of dissatisfaction with the status quo? So that one's pretty straightforward, right? People who are already unhappy are much more willing to change. People who are very smug and satisfied, who aren't getting any external data or feeds that are telling them things aren't working, are unlikely to be interested in new solutions. So the first question we ask ourselves in assessing whether to persist or whether to let go is, what is the level of dissatisfaction? If there is no dissatisfaction whatsoever in the organization around the issue right now, it's going to be hard to accomplish change. It may be so important that you decide to work at it anyway. In fact, there are ways of creating dissatisfaction. There are ways you can raise the level of dissatisfaction by educating people about why the current situation isn't tenable. But we want to just recognize that current reality. Current reality is these are satisfied people. I need a strategy to do something about that satisfaction with the status quo. The second factor, and we'll come back in a minute and talk about why this is a multiplication sign, is the clarity of the new vision. So I not only have to be dissatisfied with the way things are today, I need to have some sense of how they could be better tomorrow. Right? And those are very different things, right? You can have very dissatisfied people, but they're just unhappy. They don't have any vision for tomorrow, in which case they're not going to change. Similarly, you in your own head can have an extremely clear vision of this beautiful tomorrow, but you're offering it to a group of people who think today is just fine. Thank you very much. I'm not interested. The significance, I think, of this multiplication sign instead of an addition sign, right, is really important. This says there's an interactive effect. And an interactive effect works to help us when we've got some of both. So for instance, unhappy people tend to look for new futures. So they'll be out there searching. If you show them something, they'll find it. People with a really clear vision of a wonderful new future tend then to become dissatisfied with the way things are today, right? So that interaction really helps you. Unfortunately, those of us who remember our elementary school mathematics will remember when you're multiplying, if one of the factors is 0, the answer is 0. So we may, through design thinking, develop this wonderful, wonderful sense of this great new tomorrow. But if we have 0 dissatisfaction, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish change. Similarly, we can have very unhappy people, but if we're not offering them a better future, then it's unlikely that we're going to see much change. Third element is the pathway to the change. And when we say pathway, we mean the traditional things like, are we giving people the educational tools they need to learn the new behaviors? Have we changed the way we're rewarding them so that we're rewarding them for the new behaviors instead of the old? Really? Are we putting in place, in an organization especially, a clear path that helps them to move from today to tomorrow? And those are really critical. But the fourth piece is some ways most interesting to me, and that is, what is the loss people have in making the change? For some people, their very identity is tied up in the way they do their jobs. And when you ask them to change the way they do their job, even though to us it looks like an insignificant change, to them it is a profound loss that affects the very core of how they see themselves. When I have an initiative that I think would be a great one for the Darden School, and it's perfectly clear to me that it's wonderful and everybody should get on board behind it, I often go back to this simple little equation and I ask myself, when I look at my fellow faculty members, how dissatisfied are they with the way things are being done today? I know I'm dissatisfied, but this equation doesn't care about me, it cares about them. And obviously it's different for every single individual. Some are dissatisfied, some are not. But I ask myself, if everyone other than me and a few small handful of people are all completely satisfied, I'm going to have to figure out how to create some dissatisfaction if I'm going to move them to change. Similarly, oftentimes to their creators, the vision of the future is very, very clear. We find this with entrepreneurs. We create a clear image in our head. What happens, though, is we're unable to translate that to other people. So I know you've got a vision, and I know you're incredibly excited about it, but honestly, I don't understand what you're talking about. And I can't own it if I can't understand it. Right? So I think that's another thing I ask myself. How clear is it, this vision of the future? How clear have I made it to the people I'm trying to persuade? And then I ask, is the pathway in place? Are the rewards for the new behavior there? Are the tools there? Are the capabilities to do it there? And then finally, what do they have to lose? How much does their own identity, how much is it caught up in this? Now, I think the tools of design thinking can help us manage each of these. When you invite people into a good what is discussion and you send them out to talk to people that they are supposed to be serving, and they learn that those people have needs that are not being met, they become dissatisfied. So the tools of ethnographic interviewing, I believe, during the what is stage really help move dissatisfaction. That argues for involving as many of the people who are going to be critical to your change in that process as you can. Right? Similarly, as we build design criteria, as we take those insights and we say, okay, so this is what's going on, this is what these people need, this is what we've learned, what do those mean for an ideal future? If anything were possible, what qualities would this new idea, whatever new idea we come up with, meet? What would it take for a new idea to perfectly satisfy the needs we're hearing about? When you have that discussion, when you create a set of design criteria working together, people align and get clarity on what that new future looks like. They also, because they're part of the conversation, start to feel like there's less of a loss. We experience much more of a loss when we're told to do something rather than when we're invited into a conversation to create something. One of the wonderful things about design thinking to me, and we'll talk some about this next week, is this idea that we leave space to invite others into the conversation. If we want people to be engaged, if we want them to be excited, if we want them to own something, right? We can't get that by rolling along, creating solutions ourselves, even using the design thinking process. And at the end of this process, in which we've evolved and changed the way we think about the world in the process, then suddenly announce it to people who haven't changed because they haven't been part of the conversation. If we want to engage people, we need to, one, make it human, which is what design thinking does for us. It brings the needs of the human beings front and center. And most of us can't help but be engaged and touched when the needs of other human beings are put front and center. And then it invites them into the creation process. So again, very long-winded answer to your question, Seth, but I think this idea of when do we give up? Sometimes I look at that equation and I think, yes, I'm in love with that new curriculum idea, but I'm in love with it alone. There's no dissatisfaction. I can't really clearly communicate it. It's not going to get rewarded, and people are pretty embedded and tied up in the way the curriculum is now. That's not going to work. Do I want to fight that battle or not? Do I want to fight another battle where there is some dissatisfaction, where I do have the ability to make the future clear and maybe reward people for the right things, where there's less identification and loss? So for me personally, this has been just a kind of a silly little, how do you capture the world in 4 factors, but often helps me to think through where it's worth hanging in there and where it's worth letting go. So let's see. We haven't taken a Twitter question. I don't know. Leslie, do we have any questions from Twitter that we might want to?
Hi, Jeanne. We do. We have one here from Peter, who is asking if the customer experience needs to adopt a growth mindset for a mutually successful innovation experience.
I'm not actually sure what that means. I think certainly the people designing the customer experience have to be willing to adopt an open mindset and really learn about the customer's needs and really make the decisions through the lens of their needs. But I think one of the things that the customer probably gets to do is have whatever mindset they want as they go through the experience. I mean, that's the difference between the designer and the user, right? In some ways, we have far more responsibility as the designer. As the designer, it's our job to get inside the head of the user and to try and look at the world through their lens and to try and understand what their needs are and then to offer them something that meets them. You know, that's not the job of the user. The job of the user is to use whatever we've given them, right? It's to buy, it's to choose among a set of products, right? It's to behave in whatever way makes most sense to them. And if they don't choose the product we've designed, or if they don't choose the new process that we've designed, then we can blame them, but really it's a failure of our design. Seems kind of unfair, except that we then get to be the users in other situations and not have to worry about the designers in those cases too. So I guess that's how I would capture that.
Jeanne, I have another group of questions, some from the forum and some from Twitter that are related. It's about designing for customers that are 1,000 miles away and learning how to empathize with those customers that you may not be directly interacting with. And also for customers, a large group of customers, say you have 5 million people that you're designing for.
Well, what I would say first off is I don't know how you design for 5 million people. I mean, I think you can design for archetypes of people. You can design for different clusters of people. You can certainly design a system that lets people customize. But within those 5 million people, there are endless iterations of the different kinds of people. And this is where I put my strategy hat on. Part of your strategy is to choose which are the kinds of people that you're uniquely suited to create real value for. right? When you try and be everything to everyone in a marketplace, we know that generally doesn't work, right? That in fact, we look for opportunities where we have something unique to bring as an organization, and that our uniqueness as an organization, our unique capability set matches up with a unique set of needs that some people out there have. Now, if you said to me, how among 5 million people do you figure out the ones that you should be serving? I think that's a different question, and that's one that design thinking can help us with, because it can help us understand the needs of a set of people, and then we can look at their needs and say, well, you know, we're not really well suited to meet those needs. There are other people who are much better suited, and we should allow them to serve them. And here's the people who are kind of in the area where we've got the capabilities or where we can partner or acquire the capabilities. And so we'll serve them. So I think the 5 million, it's one of the problems we have with strategy. When you think that big, it's very difficult to go deep and understand the deep needs. Now, I think this is an area where big data that we're hearing so much about and design thinking can actually work well together. Big data may let us identify an opportunity in those 5 million people, right? So I'll give you for instance, when we look at student satisfaction scores here at the university, we know that some students are much more satisfied with their university experience than others, right? The data tells us that. If we want to improve the satisfaction of students, then it makes sense to go deep on that set of people that big data has already identified as being less satisfied and try and understand really what's driving their lack of satisfaction, right? So data will often point us into an area of opportunity, and then design thinking can let us go deep to really understand what's coming out of that. Having gone deep, it can then allow us to come back to bigger data. So once we've done a design thinking study and we've really developed a deep understanding of different types of customers we serve, as we've said, we don't know how big that segment is because we've done a very small end study, maybe 16 people. That's not enough to statistically say I can describe how many of persona X are in that population. But with that deeper understanding, I can now construct a much better survey to now survey that larger population, to understand how they fit into these categories that we've been able to create through our design thinking research. So you almost have a model where you're maybe starting with quantitative data to identify opportunity, you're going deep with design thinking to really understand, and then as you get closer to scaling and commercialization and experimentation, you're going back to more traditional quantitative methods like surveys to help us sort through and understand this larger group of 5 million as you go through it. Let me spend a minute, and I see we're almost out of time, on the virtual question. I think that's a big challenge. It's a big challenge we face in Charlottesville, because when we do design studies projects in Charlottesville, our students are taking 4 other classes. They can't leave and go off to some other place in the world and find people to interview. As we've been able to work experiencing being better and better at telephone interviews, at Skype interviews and things like that, it gets much better. So a lot of the tools and the methodologies we have now, you can have almost as good an experience of interviewing with technology face-to-face with the person as you can if you were actually in the same room with them, right? Assuming you share the same language. Now, again, as soon as we start translations and language barriers, it gets much more difficult. As soon as we are trying to reach a set of people who don't have technology, it gets much more difficult. But I think this is the big frontier for us. We know, because of classes like this one, that we can have incredibly powerful conversations with people who we've never met and would never get the chance to meet, right? How do we harness that power to use design thinking? So let me just end with one question. Some folks have asked about next steps. Next week is our last week. And one of the things that I will tell you, we'll give you lots more information, but we think of this Coursera course as the first step on a journey of learning design thinking. And we have developed some much more extensive coursework at Darden that is actually project focused, which is your next step. I think if you like what's going on in design thinking and you really want to master it, then what's important is for you to begin to work with a project. And there's lots of different methodologies that you can use to work through a project. Our field book offers one. Our asynchronous online material offers another. Online, people like IDEO and Frog are offering their own processes. So there's a lot out there. Whatever you choose, I think what's important is that you get out there, roll up your sleeves, pick a project, and end to end, try and move through the design thinking project. But we'll be talking a lot more about that next week and be sending you some follow-up information. So it has been great to spend the hour with you. I hope you found it useful, and I will look forward to seeing you shortly online again. Thank you.